So how does a PRXRF work exactly? A sample is irradiated by an intense X-ray beam, and this causes electrons in the inner shell of atoms to be ejected. Electrons found in the outer shells then fill in the spaces of the unoccupied electron's position. And this causes a release of fluorescent X-rays, whose wavelength or energy is used to identify the atom. Outer shell electrons are bounded to the atom with less energy than the inner shell electrons. In the case of the device that I'm using, we are measuring the energy of the fluorescent X-ray. Relaxation of the excited atom to the ground state is accompanied by the emission of the fluorescent X-ray. Each element gives off a specific level of energy characteristic of its electron composition, and the interaction of the outer electrons replacing the inner electrons that were ejected, which tells us what elements are present. And by counting the number of X-rays having that energy level, we can determine the concentration of that element. So basically, an intense X-ray bombards a ceramic sample, causing the electrons in the atoms that are found within that sample to be ejected. And the electrons that are ejected are the electrons that are found closest to the nucleus of the atom. And then the positions that those electrons used to have orbiting around the nucleus get filled in by electrons in these outer shells. And when that happens, a fluorescent radiation is emitted and is detected by the PRXRF unit. Each element has a specific energy level because of the number of electrons associated with the atom. And the number of X-rays that are basically that are being emitted back to the device tells us the composition for each of those energy levels. So we have an energy level and a number of X-rays that determine a trace element's composition within the ceramic artifact. Once the elemental composition is determined, quantitative values in parts per million for each trace element are calibrated and then analyzed using the statistical tool of principal component analysis. This approach is used to analyze multiple variables in order to explore visually patterns in the way the data clusters. Principal component analysis has shown the trace elements load on one or two components, with strontium loading primarily by itself on the second component and other elements loading on the first component. The component scores produced using principal component analysis for each sample were then graphed on a bivariate plot, with component 2 scores plotting on the y-axis and the component 1 scores on the x-axis. Principal component analysis was ran for all 392 shards that were included in this study, as well as the geological clay samples, together and separately for the Neolithic period, the Zebuj, Giganti, and Targine phases of the Temple period, and the Targine Cemetery and Borj Nadar phases of the Maltese Bronze Age. And this produced cluster patterns, as you see in this particular graph. This is basically all the shards in geological clays that were tested. And you can see the general patterns that were formed by the statistical analysis. I then analyzed the data for each of the chronological periods for the Neolithic, the Gibuge phase of the Temple period, Gigantia phase of the Temple period, the Targine phase of the Temple period, and this is the graph for the Targine cemetery phase shards that were analyzed, the Borj-Nadar phase shards that were analyzed for the Middle Bronze Age. I was also able to analyze the Mycenaean shard that was recovered from the reused portion of the prehistoric temple at Borj-Nadar, referred to as the Double Chapel. This shard comes from a vessel called a calyx. A calyx was basically a drinking cup used by the Mycenaeans in a ceremonial or ritual context. The trace elemental composition of this shard indicates, however, that it is made of a local clay source to Malta. And this is significant because it was believed that this shard came from a calyx that was produced outside of Malta, indicating that the Mycenaeans were in contact directly with the Maltese during the Borj-Nadar phase of the Middle Bronze Age. The fact that it's a local reproduction, essentially, suggests, on the other hand, that that the Mycenaeans may have not actually had direct contact with the Maltese, and that it supports the theory that the Mycenaeans, while they did establish settlements in Sicily, the Maltese came in contact with the Mycenaeans through their interaction with the Sicilians. In other words, someone from Malta went to Sicily, probably participated in the ritual ceremony that was taking place that involved this calyx, went back to Malta and reproduced a version of the calyx to be used in Malta from local clays. The research provides chemical support to what has been observed archaeologically about Maltese prehistoric pottery and its relationship with other contemporary wares from Sicily, the Aeolian Islands, and southern Italy. Overall, the research shows that Maltese pottery is made from local Maltese clay sources. That would seem to be of no surprise. It is possible that the ceramic production centers may either be located in each of the temple communities and that they shared the same clay outcrops with each other, or that the temple communities shared the same ceramic production centers. Since the pottery that was analyzed in this study was associated with a ritual context, it is possible that the ceramics were produced from a shared workshop that distributed the wares to all the temples on the Maltese Islands. This may especially be the case in the Targine phase when offering bowls appear to be more standardized. Considering the size of the island of Malta, this would not be unrealistic. The research adds another piece to the puzzle, so to speak, of our understanding of Maltese prehistory. The research provides additional validation that there is a connection between the Stentinello and Diana cultures in Sicily and the Maltese inhabitants during the Neolithic. The research also suggests that pottery may have been imported into the Maltese islands up until the Gibbouge phase. Further, the research suggests that pottery was not being imported into Malta from anywhere during the Gigantia phase, when monumental construction commences and when it is believed Malta begins its period of cultural isolation. The results correspond with archaeological observations of Maltese pottery not showing signs of sharing any characteristics with pottery from outside the archipelago during this period. The research also raises new questions about the Targine phase with regard to additional clay sources potentially being accessed by ancient Maltese potters in their ceramic production during this period. The research provides the first evidence that pottery played an active role as an exported item during the Targine cemetery phase. And the research gives new insight into the potential relationship between the Mycenaean merchants and the people of Malta, one that is indirect in nature.